Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Bover with DesignWell 365, and welcome to the podcast. In the world of acoustic design, form can be valued just as highly as function. For EzoBoard, this methodology runs through just about every single one of their products, including their newly spun up sister company, Quiet Earth Moss. Combining lush botanical living wall installations with EzoBoard's acoustical material, Quiet Earth Moss creates a unique product capitalizing on nature's beautiful design and sound dampening capabilities. This week, I am joined by Doug Barlett, founder of EzoBoard, to talk more about the nature of acoustics in buildings today and how Quiet Earth Moss's unique product aims to make a calming environment in more ways than one.
Thank you for tuning in. If you liked what you saw, be sure to hit the like button on your way out, and also subscribe to DesignWell's YouTube channel and hit the bell icon if you want to stay informed of any new updates. Alternatively, you can find any of our podcasts over on Apple or Spotify and leave a review there.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Bover. I'm here with DesignWell 365, and today I have with me Doug Barlett of EzoBoard and also the recently launched Quiet Earth Moss. Doug, I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself before we get started.
Thank you very much, Nick, and it's nice to be here this morning to join you for this podcast. My name is Doug Barlett. As Nick's pointed out, I am the founder of EzoBoard, and also we've recently launched the Quiet Earth Moss brand. I'm CEO of the Airsonics group of companies, which we're situated across North America. So again, thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. And it's one of those things where when I first heard about Quiet Earth Moss, I just heard about it from a press release. It was very interesting to hear. You hear about biophilic installations all the time. And I live in and around Boston. We have a big firm out that way called Cityscapes that is big in the biophilic installation, but I've never really heard of preserved moss and these types of installations in general being used for acoustical purposes like you guys do with Quiet Earth Moss. And I was kind of wondering what prompted the move into this direction to go from working on acoustics to add that biophilic element into acoustics.
Well, I would say it started back in 2016. I was in Europe, and I had encountered a company out of Norway, two young gentlemen that had been promoting moss as a biophilic treatment for commercial spaces, and that was quite early on when you think back. I mean, that's going back 5 or 6 years now. But it just struck me as such a perfect fit with what we've been doing with our EzoBoard brand. And I can tell you, when I walked into the small booth that they had at this show in Germany, it immediately occurred to me that the acoustics were performing very well. And it compelled me to ask them, okay, what do you have behind this moss? And they said, well, nothing. It's just kind of trade show hard booth display board. I said, well, that's very interesting. So that stayed with me from 2016. And it's just kind of like that. And it ended up, when something of that significance, comes across our pathway, it ends up, being kind of a project concept. Over time, we ended up encountering somebody here in Canada. Also, her name is Carmen, and she is the product manager for Quiet Earth Moss. And she was a specialist in the area. She was out of Alberta. She was working in this. So, of course, when we met her and her couple of years in that industry specifically, kind of her path crossed ours. It's like this is the time to act on this. So it was really convergence of those things, going back to 2016 and then meeting Carmen.
So 2016, I know that, obviously the idea to kind of formulate a company is a very long and extensive process, and there's a lot that can go there's a lot that can happen along the way. And I know one of the big things that happened between probably then and the eventual launch of Quiet Earth Moss was the pandemic. And so I'm curious if in it during that launch, and even to this day, because we still have the supply chain issues going around, if you encountered any challenges related to that, venturing off into this new kind of brand.
I would have to say, yeah, we did experience some because the material is coming in from different points. You know, like I mentioned, Norway actually is one of the origins of this material. So it is being brought in by ocean. In some cases, we've actually, when we got the beginning of the our distribution going, it actually, some of it was being air freighted in. So, you know, but we've managed to overcome those supply chain concerns at this point, and you know, we're doing quite well. That the growth of the Quiet Earth Moss brand is exponential for us. But again, you know, we're anticipating still some challenges this year. We would expect, as most industries are, but we've worked through a lot of that already, and I'm happy to say that we're in a good place right now.
That's really great to hear, especially with, like we said, everything that's been going on right now. I'm kind of curious with just the idea of moss in general. You mentioned that you were shipping some of the stuff over from Norway at one point. I'm curious, have you ever looked into regional types of moss? Because I know I personally come from New England. You had mentioned Canada, and I know those areas, very damp, very wet climates that are very conducive to moss. And, you know, I like to go hiking all the time, and I will just come across entire forests that are just covered in moss. So I was wondering if you ever thought of using any of like regional varieties in the boards.
Very much so, Nick. In fact, we've been involved in discussions with a operation in Northern Ontario. We did bring in some material from that operation, and it is part of our supply chain plans. That is how Airsonics does function. We are very much focused on domestic supply and regional fulfillment, as you and I had discussed before in our last call, and that's very important to us. Any opportunity that we can procure material, raw material, locally, we will take a hard look at. In this particular case, that operation in Northern Ontario had some issues with their harvesting. There was some problem, may have been related to drought or some other things that have occurred. Being a natural product, there's some things that will come up on the supply chain end that just, you know, you have to contend with. So our strategy is to have a focus on continued supply of a quality nature. That's number one. Number two, and right up there beside that is, of course, is trying to procure the raw materials as much locally as we possibly can. So that's going to continue. It's not like we're going to walk away from that. We're definitely not. We're going to continue to explore those avenues. And that's an Airsonics credo.
And that's great, really great to hear, especially from a design standpoint, because I know one of the big things that always usually seems to come with local variety of plants, especially plants, is they always have a very specific character. They always have like a specific signature to them, and they always add a specific element to a space more so than, say, an imported brand would. So that's, like I said, really great to hear. So I guess kind of drilling down into the product a little bit more, what would you say are the benefits of a living moss acoustic installation over, say, a traditional foam installation?
Well, first of all, it's got specific acoustical characteristics that blend beautifully with the EzoBoard product. When you encounter a combination of those two materials in a space, you're going to notice the effect of the sound immediately, which is kind of has a calming effect when you walk into a nicely controlled acoustical environment. That's number one. But then, of course, on the visual side of it as well, having the greenery in front of you and also the overall impression that you get. So you've got two of our major senses that are responding at the same moment, you know, and that's really important in terms of making people feel good about being in the space when they first enter it, and it makes you want to remain there. And that's something that we feel is going to be a big part of office reopening and other commercial spaces. And it'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds. In terms of acoustics, the moss behaves differently acoustically than the EzoBoard material, and a lot of that has to do with density and the nature of the material itself. One thing about the moss that's occurred to me is that it's thicker, and you could say, of course, it's softer, so it therefore has different acoustic characteristics to it. And it's not, I would say, it's not picking up a lot of low frequencies. It's typically going to be working well in the upper frequency range. This is my view of it and the experience I've had so far. Now, and I'll qualify that by saying I'm not an acoustical consultant. I think I explained to you before, I've had a kind of long history in acoustics, but it tends to come from the music production end of things.
Right.
But I recognize what it's doing, and it has to do with high frequencies. The EzoBoard material is compatible because it's absorbing it from very strong at the mid frequencies and going down. It's kind of a curve like that, and in that case, the combination of those two things, you could say, it's kind of tuning the acoustics in that sense. They're compatible with each other.
Okay, that's very interesting. I kind of, I'm glad that you kind of talked about the range that moss will kind of accept as far as sound is concerned, because that's one of the things that I figure a lot of people will probably think about when they think of living, a living material. They think of it kind of being somewhat inconsistent, a little chaotic, a little bit different from what we're able to kind of like manufacture on a reliable basis. And I guess owing to that idea, I'm kind of curious, what's the process like trying to figure out what moss board to build for a particular space? Kind of going back to that idea of it's organic, it's natural, it has variations to it.
Well, that's a really good point. Essentially, you could end up testing every day different permutations. They're limitless, so you kind of have to look at it from a more broad point of view. And in that, there are certain kind of conclusions that you can make in terms of, what amount of material is going to be added to the surface of an acoustical substrate like EzoBoard of the moss. So is it going to be 1 inch thick? Because you're going to deal with certain physical characteristics about the depth of it based on the design and what you're trying to achieve, and of the material itself. What I've noticed is that there's a certain consistency to the depth of the raw material itself, a certain scale to it, let's say it like that. And then, of course, as it's being laid up, and it's very much a manual, artisanal process in terms of laying it up, and I'm sure you've recognized that in different installations you've seen images of, or in a real space. So in a case like that, you start to see, I would say, kind of common applications for depth and just distribution or dispersion of the material itself. Those are the things that you would then commence to do kind of more formal testing on, and then you would lay it up with materials of a certain thickness. Again, coming back to EzoBoard. We have standard thicknesses ranging all the way from, at this point, all the way from like less than 1/4 of an inch all the way up to 2 inches thick with our whole new Ezo layers program. But most common thicknesses are 3/8 inch and 1/2 inch. So you're going to find that a lot of quiet earth moss features are laid up on one of those thicknesses. So in that case, okay, now we're starting to build something out that would be somewhat consistent. And it's those things that you would send for the NRC testing, which is to the American Standard Test Method C423. And that applies to any acoustical material, whether it's moss or some composite of EzoBoard and moss, this kind of thing, but it would still fall within that particular test standard. And that's where it gets really interesting. Okay, well, this is the density that we did, because you still have to track what happened there. And how do you do that? Well, it's going to be by weight, really, when you think about it. because that's really the only way to do it, because you're not going to measure each and every little tuft of moss. You can't do that, right?
Right.
It's going to end up being by weight, and weight has a lot to do with things. Mass has to do with acoustics as well. It's another matter. So it's, without getting overly complicated about it, that's kind of really the shortest path to having some consistency on the acoustical performance of that kind of material.
Well, yeah, it definitely sounds like you have it down to pretty much a science at that point when it comes to designing everything. The other question I was going to do is kind of like a follow-up was going to be the length of time it takes to set up. But I'm assuming just based, you're welcome to contradict me, but I'm assuming just based on what you said, it probably sounds like it doesn't take any much longer than a traditional installation setup, because you guys kind of already know what you need and what works.
Yeah, we try to minimize the installation time on site. Naturally, that's very important, right? And also, we build features such that they can manage the handling on a site and go up well and look fantastic, which they do. So a lot of that has to do, again, coming back to EzoBoard, which is really doing a great job in terms of not just the acoustics, but it's a very robust material. So it acts as the substrate for structural reasons too, as the moss is being laid up on a wall. It's very important, So the speed of installation is always in our minds in terms of doing custom features of the two materials together, and making sure that it gets there, of course, in good shape.
Nice. And I guess the other question that I have as a follow-up to that, it's the dirty question. I think everybody really hates to talk about it, but at the same time, we all have to talk about it. What are the costs associated for one of these walls in comparison to, say, a traditional foam installation?
Well, again, the acoustics market in general really has an extremely wide range. You can go all the way from a few dollars per square foot, literally up to hundreds of dollars per square foot. And depending on the materials you're working in, the environment, the demands of the space, how you're tuning the sound in the space, all these things come into play. Quiet earth moss tends to be, depending on what we're doing with the material, the type of moss and how it's being laid up, its averages somewhere in the lower end of that spectrum. But again, it's, to be honest with you, Nick, it's usually quoted on a project by project basis, depending on what we're being asked to do. So even within our realm, I would say the average that I've seen is typically between $75 and $100 a square foot. That is kind of an average, and that's before any kind of project volume discounts or anything like that. So, and what we try to do is we try to work within the customer's or the specifier's budget. It's very important, because there's a lot of things that we can do to value engineer our acoustical solutions, and that goes for both brands or both brands combined, always. So, and sometimes a customer may be reluctant to say, well, I'm not sure, or if they have a number, they don't want to say that up front, right? But to be honest with you, it just saves a lot of time, because we're always value conscious. We want to help our clients. We want to get the best possible result, and we want to do a beautiful job to make people feel good. It's very inspiring for us. So cost always does matter in qualifying that. And I'm glad you asked, because, that's something that people really often kind of don't want to go there. And in my view, it's better to get it out up front. Look, we got $75 a square foot to work with, guys. What can you bring to the table? Well, thank you for sharing that with us. This is where we're going to start. We're going to get the best that we can within your range.
Yeah. Just coming from a creative background, because I went to school for English for a while, and I went to school and I did a lot of work in creative writing. One of the things that I found, kind of owing to what you say, it's like, hey, so long as we can get the money and the limitations up front, we know what we can work with. And I feel as though some of the best installations, some of the best creative work usually comes out of having those restrictions placed on you at the forefront.
And yeah, and you could call them restrictions, but in a way, they're you know, they are what they are. They're realities in terms of what can be spent. Sometimes, you know, the other thing that's interesting, this is what we find in the acoustics business general. Sometimes there's funding that can come from another area to build out, because we're doing a few different things that may in the value engineering process, where you're actually correcting some other things that they hadn't thought about. So we like to explore those kind of things.
Okay, that's very interesting. Do you have any kind of like specifics where that's come up in a project?
Yeah. For example, like, okay, in the case of coming back to EzoBoard, okay, ceiling projects. Well, oftentimes it's like, okay, well, yeah, we know we need some ceiling baffles. We're thinking about doing baffles on these floors, etc. You know, oftentimes people are thinking about, you know, when it comes to that product, individual suspension. Well, that's a lot of time up on a skyjack if you're doing thousands of baffles, right? And each one's individually suspended, and the time to install. Using more common elements that might be coming from another contractor, like a ceiling grid, which we have you know, worked up well in terms of mounting our materials to ceiling grids, because they're commonly available, they're cost effective. Contractors know how to go in and do entire floors of them, they're wherever they're required, and we can mount to that. In fact, we got a patent just under a year ago for mounting our materials directly to T-bar grids. So if there's a budget somewhere else for that, and they already know kind of how they got that tightly dialed in cost wise, well, we can carry that over to what we're doing, or we can, or say, look, you know what, we're going to exclude that from anything that we're providing, and that's over there, and we're going to help, and we're going to collaborate with that contractor to keep your costs down.
I feel like I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, how you have a kind of manufacturing facility out in Boston, and my dad works out in Boston all the time. He's a construction worker. He's actually the one that's usually putting up those ceiling grids. So maybe at some point you guys will cross paths on a job site.
I would love that, you know, and the more that we can collaborate with people in the know of that high level of expertise, they've made a career of it, then there's just a lot of interesting things, ideas that come out of that. And it's one of the favorite part of my job, you know, like it's just to meet new people that are saying, hey, did you think about that? It's like, you know what? It's a great idea. You know.
Yeah. So getting back to the moss walls, what is the maintenance like on these types of walls? Because I know they're preserved moss, but I feel as though that's like another big question that a lot of people have. Like, what's the difference between preserved moss and actual living moss? And like, is there any maintenance behind them?
There's no watering required on preserved moss. It's something that is simply installed without requiring anything on site. You know, we have dry climates up here in the north, as you well know, you know, in the winter, you know, things dry out, but I've been amazed to see how well it sustains its softness. That's the thing to me that I find most impressive about this material through the preservation process. You would think that it would dry it out, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
you would. And it, you know, if you ever had a toy train set when you were a kid, and you had, you know, the small trees and that kind of thing that were all laid out around there, and you remember how brittle that was, and you touched it, it would kind of disintegrate. You know, anyways, this is not the case with preserved moss. It retains its humidity. And typically the life expectancy is somewhere between 4 and 8 years in terms of it maintaining that. And that would depend largely on where it's located in the space, having to do with whether it's going to be, you know, subject to touching or you know, being bumped into in a corridor or whatever. But that's on the website as well, on the Quiet Earth Moss website. There's a lot of FAQs that it's very good information there. There's a whole range of them. So I would recommend anybody interested in more detail about that, then please visit the Quiet Earth Moss website.
Yeah, it's something that is very. I was actually looking at it a little bit before this podcast just to kind of like get an idea, because it's like it's one of those things going into it. I didn't want it to seem like as somebody who is really into these types of installations, I kind of wanted to be able to ask the questions, what are some questions that people aren't going to know at first going into these types of installations? Like what is the average person thinking about if this is their first time hearing about an acoustic moss installation?
I think a lot of it is driven by the need for more greenery in the space. I think there's an emotional response to this material. This is what I'm witnessing. It's what I'm feeling about it myself. That's the first thing. How do I, feeling good about being somewhere? That's important, right? More so now than ever before, I think, and when I think about it. And so that happens to be the first consideration. I think designers and other specifiers are looking at it going, this is a really good place to do this. And I think given the nature of it, maybe it's a place where people congregate in the space. You want them to feel good. That's the first thing. And then the acoustic benefits. I think those are things that come behind that. What I've seen so far, because to your point earlier, Nick, like you're asking about, okay, what are some of the acoustic characteristics of the moss itself? Well, the range is quite a bit, kind of like the cost issue. We can go from A to Z, depending on how it's applied. So we will deal with each one of those kind of characteristics in due course, but I think how it starts is on the emotional level.
Yeah, and I would agree with you with that. A lot of the things that I have been seeing is just trying to get nature back into these spaces, and it's something that like really, for me personally, really resonates with me, because as a kid, I was one of those kids that always had the dream of, I'd be walking through Kmart or Ames, and I'd be looking at all of like the fake vines that they have sitting around. I'd be like, oh, it'd be cool if I could turn my room into a jungle or something like that. And I'm glad that everybody is kind of starting to think about that. Maybe not like a tropical rainforest jungle, but like turning it into more of a natural space. And there's been a lot of research that's coming out about these natural spaces, and not just, like you said, there's the visual and the audio component. I mean, obviously there's a lot of research that's been done just into, how a body reacts to being in a natural environment or a more natural environment. But even the sound, there's been research done into the acoustical properties of nature and just how nature sounds and how that can overall affect our health and well-being. There was one study that I saw that's actually talking about water installation. So just like running water in a building, not only is that an amazing sound masking application, because it'll surprisingly cut out a lot of like traffic within an area if you're talking about a water installation in a city. But just the sound of water is enough to like lower people's heart rates, kind of reduce stress levels in them. And so I think, like you said, acoustic moss is kind of one of those, it's like killing two birds with one stone would be a bad analogy when talking about, wellness and sustainability, but that's the only one that's coming to mind. But that's what it is. You're striking two chords at the same time, and it's something that really resonates with everybody.
Absolutely, and you're making a musical reference there. It's something that Jimmy Page said one time about his double neck guitar. Remember that when he played live for Stairway to Heaven? Okay, well, let's.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, guess what he said? He said that he liked to leave the volume open on the second guitar, even though he was playing the one on the top, because it was in sympathy with what he was playing on the top. It was resonating in a certain way that he found very pleasing. And I liken that to what's going on with the moss in terms of, you said striking two chords, which is making me think about this musical analogy. And I see it the same way. I think it's it's doing a couple of things to us internally as humans that are very important. We're resonating with it. You know, we're resonating with it visually, we're resonating it with acoustically. And I think these things add up to emotional responses that make us feel good. And we need more of that. That's what it comes down to me. Just kind of like Jimmy Page, he liked the way it sounded. It made him feel good. He loved it, right? And I can see why. You know?
Exactly. So I guess we're kind of, I'm just now noticing the time, and I don't want to hold you up for too long. I do have a couple of questions remaining. So if you've got the time, I've got the gumption to ask them.
Yeah, please do.
All right. So getting into kind of what's next in the what's in the future of Quiet Earth Moss. I was actually kind of curious if at this point, you know, just talking with you, it seems like you have kind of like an extensive R&D department almost for testing out these new different types of applications. Have you at any point like looked into any types of alternative organic materials to use as acoustical material? Because one of the things that I came across recently is mycelium, and basically the fungal network of mushrooms, which the way you're nodding, I'm sure you've heard about. But it's one of those amazing things where it's like you can make a brick out of it, and there's so many different applications. But one of the applications that I heard about it was for acoustical absorption, essentially.
There are a lot of fascinating materials, both of a organic and inorganic nature, you know, and the organic side of materials we're very interested in are pursuing their acoustical characteristics, and that's, to me, you know, examples would be like jute or hemp or eucalyptus fiber. Eucalyptus is a very interesting fiber. Bamboo as well. And what I mentioned to you when we last spoke, Nick, we made a significant investment in production equipment. Well, guess what? It's going to work with those different types of fibers. Now, I'm not sure about the mushroom example. We'll see what that all means, but that's a very interesting one too. And why would we not pursue that? Of course we are, and there are plans for that. Now, it may end up being an entirely new brand, and it probably will. So heads up on that, and more on that when we speak maybe next. But we are looking at also materials of an entirely scrap nature, ground up carpets, denim. Just all these things can be combined into acoustical substrates. And in a way, even if they don't have a grade, so-called A grade surface finish on the material, it's beautiful in its own right. And I think there's going to be a trend toward having those raw materials repurposed with a visual statement reflecting what they really are, right? Because I think it's a reminder of what we need to do in general. Anyways, hey, let's reuse this for this. I was recently with one of my brothers, and he was asking me if I knew where he could buy a pair of sandals made out of rubber tire tread. And, you know, I didn't have an answer for him, but I thought, I like that. I like the sound of that. So anyways, in the acoustic end, more on that later. And thanks. I'll make a note of that mushroom example, but we're definitely pursuing that, you know, and as we should, like I said.
I was going to say the mushroom one is definitely on the more odder sides that I have seen, but I am somebody who's a big
mushrooms.
I am a big nerd when it comes to kind of like those alternative methods when it comes to building sciences. Those are the things that always like kind of get my brain sparking.
I would love to share with you some of the things that we find out as we move forward, and it probably will be under a new brand, so another sister brand to both EzoBoard and Quiet Earth Moss. So more on that later, as I said.
I was going to say, I'd love to be in touch with you on that.
Yeah, by all means, we'll stay in touch. Yeah.
So I guess and sort of cribbing off of what you were saying with the jeans and like all of the recycled material and the different fibers. I think just kind of going back to what we were saying previously about it being not just an acoustical aspect but an aesthetic aspect for a space. Having the options between all of those different types of materials really kind of opens itself up to a lot of different designs for spaces, because that's another big thing that I've been seeing a lot when it comes to sort of this revolution where, you know, the age old argument form over function is kind of starting to get obliterated, because now we're having these incredibly functional and incredibly aesthetic pieces that are being developed, and I feel like moving in that direction is it's going to open up a lot of possibilities for designers and builders in general to work with the interior design of a space while also making sure that you have all of these really nice sounding acoustical aspects that kind of contribute to the overall well-being of a space.
Absolutely. And similar to the Quiet Earth Moss installations, which are each unique in their own way, because you think about it, it's an artisanal method of putting them together in the plant. And the same thing would apply to these other materials. Each one is going to be unique when you think about it. You know, it's not going to be combined exactly in the same way as some new product that's coming off some line. It's going to be unique in its own right and beautiful in that sense, you know. So I think as people that are involved in the commercial interiors business and interior design, I think we have to prepare ourselves for that. There's beauty in that uniqueness, and I think our tastes will eventually all kind of subscribe to that. I hope, because I think that's where we need to go. It's gonna allow us a better yield too, when you think about it, because if you're making allowances for variation of the material that's in a large installation, then it's okay to have variation, and it means that you're going to be using up to 100% of what's coming off the line of those materials, which is exactly what we should be doing. So I think we do have kind of an adjustment we have to make that way as people in the commercial interiors business. We have to be prepared for that, but I think it's going to happen naturally anyways.
Yeah, that seems to be the way that it's going, definitely.
Yeah.
And so I guess for my final question, and this is kind of going off of what I had just talked about with the different materials being perfect for kind of like designers and the interior design of a space. I'm actually kind of curious because, you know, we've mostly been talking about these big grand scale installations. And I know that in general, Quiet Earth Moss is more of, you know, somebody contacts you, you write up a quote, you do the installation for them. But is there any way for, say, like an individual designer or a remodeler, somebody who's working on like a client's home, is there any way for them to contact you to kind of requisition like a product so that so it can be installed in those homes? Or
yes, we do invite that, and in fact, then a number of the products that we've made, even on larger jobs, when you break them down, they're easily manageable. So they can be easily handled and applied by a consumer in a residential environment. There's virtually no restrictions that way. It really just comes down to the size of the unit, call it that, this piece itself going up is kind of like a tile. It's a prefabricated tile that would have EzoBoard and the Quiet Earth Moss ready to install. In some cases, it's going to be a peel and stick. You know, depending on what, frankly, it'd be good to have it just if it's mounted by mechanical means, like just simple screws and this kind of thing, where it's kind of hidden, and instead of using adhesives, because it's better for recycling down the road as well. But yeah, by all means, I mean, cartons of these kinds of tiles would be made available to clients that would like to do it themselves, the kind of DIY homeowners.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah, we don't have it on e-commerce at this point. It may come. I may say to you at some point, hey, Nick, check out the Quiet Earth Moss e-com site. Here it is for consumers. But at this point, it's quote by quote.
All right. Well, that was great getting a chance to talk to you on all of that. I feel as though I have come out of this knowing a lot more knowledgeable when it comes to just the acoustical properties of biophilia or living moss in general. I'm always so bad when it comes to just closing comments.
Yeah, well, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. I find that our conversations always take their own kind of path, and that's good. And it's something I would really like to talk to you about. Is I think we share a lot of the same kind of interests that way, and I'd like to engage that again when the time is right for us both.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll keep in touch as always.
Yeah, by all means. So appreciate you having me on this morning, Nick.